few interviews with Gaddafi, and it was really my first assignment abroad, so to speak, because in Paris is very European and Western, and the phones work and everything, and being put on a plane to Libya. I think I pretended to be very brave, but I do remember sitting there thinking, what do you do? And of course in those days no one helps you, no one tells you you can go to the embassy and get briefed or do this or that, so I kind of wandered around Tripoli trying to find things to write about and met the right people and did interviews with Gaddafi, who then wasn't giving interviews, and gave me a couple, and it was all very strange times because there were no phones, so we were filing by telex in those days, and you had to bribe the telex operator and feed your tapes through, and people kept trying to steal telex tapes. It was all kind of mad. And then being bombed that night, I remember doing an interview with Gaddafi a couple days before, and I asked him the question, well, you know, you're sitting here and about to be bombed by the Americans. I mean, some absurd question like, how does that feel? And he looked at me and said, how do you know that? And I said, well, I heard it on the BBC. That's how naive I was. And he jumped up and kind of ran across the room and turned on the BBC. So these were very surreal days. Looking back on it, it seems even stranger, but I thought this was all completely normal. It's my first assignment.
How long were you there? Okay. Yeah. Bound like this, so some afternoon somebody probably will.
So
anyway.
You just do that with your hair?
Yeah, with it coming out, yes. I made the mistake, and I got back from Tehran of just getting so fed up. I told my hairdresser to chop it off, and he did.
How long were you rolling again?
Yep. Yeah.
How long were you in Libya?
I was in Libya for about a month, a couple of weeks before the bombing, a bit more than a month, and I stayed a couple of weeks afterwards, because you remember that night, Bab el-Zizia, Gaddafi's barracks were bombed. He then disappeared. It was all very unclear who was running the country, where he was, what had happened. In retrospect, it wasn't. It was probably the first smart bombing, so to speak. I mean, it was quite specific. Al-Zizia was bombed, and a couple places in Sirte were bombed. But at the time, I remember standing up on top of
And Benghazi.
And Benghazi, that's right.
I'm the one that planned it.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
I never knew that. How interesting.
Strange world, isn't it?
So you hit.
Yeah.
What did you?
Oh,
okay,
later
fess up
on.
now.
Later
Were you
on.
trying to assassinate him or not?
Well, not to get too far diverted. We probably ought to talk about this afterwards. But I mean, in an operation like that, if he became one of the casualties, no one was going to complain too much. I can assure you that. But as eventually came out, and later on the following year, there were a number of initiatives undertaken to try to find exactly where he was. None of them successful. We should have known about you.
Did you think at the time that you knew where he was?
Well, we talk about this afterwards when the tape's not on.
He wasn't in the tent.
Yeah. No, we know that. After you came back from Libya, went back to Paris, did you have it in mind then to become what we would call a war correspondent?
No. I think it's a quite... Let me just think about this for a minute. It's very restrictive. I still don't think of myself as a war correspondent, even though I've covered wars for 15 years.
What is a war correspondent?
I think that term is very restrictive. I've been in a lot of wars, covered a lot of wars, and you know my interest particularly is in the Middle East. And usually, when you go on a story, you cover in the Middle East. It does tend to be conflict, Chechnya, East Timor. Well, initial definition of war correspondent is someone who covers wars, but covering to me it makes it sound like what you're doing is going out and, you know, how many tank shells fell on this Chechen village today, or that's not what I think of myself as doing. I think, you know, war is about what happens to people. A lot of other things happen to people. I've covered famine in Ethiopia and other places like that. there's not really a term, I suppose. I am a war correspondent, but more by default, because what does happen to people in a situation like that is what interests me. And also you get sent there because they know you're not going to crack up, I suppose. So,
well, let me try to look somewhat differently. William Howard Russell is widely respected as the first war correspondent. He's the first independent journalist to be allowed access during the Crimean War, and of course it's for this great newspaper, and describes himself, and is described by many others historically, as a man who had great compassion for the people who were the victims of war, saw man's inhumanity to man in war, and as a warrior and as a person who now reports on that, I can certainly agree with that assessment. One does not therefore necessarily have to become a war correspondent, as it were, one who is intimately familiar with every caliber of ordnance, but rather one who has an eye and perhaps a gift for reporting accurately on what's happening to the people, not just the physical structures of
yeah,
war.
I would say that's what I do, and I very much care about doing.
When after Libya, what's the first area of conflict that you get sent to cover?
I joined the Sunday Times after that, and was sent to Beirut, which was civil war. Very, again, a completely different situation. Libya, you're being bombed from the air. It's quite specific. You either survive or you don't. Beirut was a very different situation. It was, it was Amal, it was Hezbollah, I was in West Beirut, but you also had the East, Christian militias who every once in a while would bomb West Beirut, and you had the hostage takers. So that was a low-level, constant anxiety, which in a lot of ways is more difficult to deal with, but you get used to it.
Before you went to Beirut, were you familiar with all the different factions? I mean, you mentioned Hezbollah, but there was also Islamic Jihad. There were Imad Mughniya, who was moving back and forth among all of the various players. And as you put it, the hostage takers. There were suicide terrorists who would 3 times blow up the American embassy. And,
right.
And then eventually, of course, the Marine...
that was before my time. Yeah, I went there first in '86.
But in preparing to go there, did you read up on all of what was going on? I mean, did you use the resources of the newspaper to find out who are these people, what's the green line, all that stuff?
I read up extensively and talked to people, and what I found, very much in almost every other situation I have been in, it didn't mean anything. And I can't, that doesn't mean that this book isn't good or that book isn't good. Certainly I think going into any situation like that, the history and the ability to put into context what's happening in a war, in any situation like that, is important. But I've never felt prepared to the extent that what was going on the ground had anything to do with what I'd read up, except in a historical sense. And I think, I don't think that's a bad thing, but once you've done it once or twice, the most important thing to me, and I think successful war correspondents, is you get there and you just have to be able to deal with absolutely anything and expect anything. If you go into a situation where people are shooting at each other, and increasingly, and I think that's the change in covering wars, increasingly at journalists, you basically have to be ready for everything and not go in and say, okay, I'm an expert, I know what's going to happen here, because it never happens the way you think it's going to.
How long were you in Beirut?
I didn't live in Beirut. I was in and out of Beirut after '86, and up until early '90s, really. But the kind of civil war chain, it was the Western militias, and then it was the Aoun. So.
And then the Syrians.
And then the Syrians, yeah.
Ah, yes.
So various. I mean, it's almost impossible to remember how many different Civil wars went on there.
Where'd you stay in Beirut?
The Commodore.
I'm wondering if we were there at the same time.
Oh, that would be really, really infuriating if you were there and I didn't know you were
It would be
there.
astounding. Well, I wasn't on my
What year were you there?
84, 85, 86. Yeah.
So 86 was when I went.
Yeah.
We might have crossed. The famous parrot. Do you remember that mad parrot?
Let's talk about you. After Beirut, you get sent on some incredibly difficult assignments. I mean, I think of Chechnya and, of course, Sri Lanka. In terms of getting assigned, did you lobby the editor and say, hey, look, there's something going on here that you need to cover that we don't have anybody here? Or did the editors say, hey, Marie, it's time for you to go cover this?
I think every paper's different. Sunday Times, and also I've been there so long. I've been there 15 years. The way that it works, if there's a straightforward, my area being Middle East, or it's sort of now blossomed to anywhere there's a war, but for example, if there's the Iran-Iraq War, which I covered, or the first Gulf War, 1991, and certainly the last Gulf War, that's almost like a set piece. Of course you'll go. In Chechnya, it's the other way around. I felt that it was not being covered. It was, and it still is, just a long-running and awful war that is generally covered from the Russian side, and I wanted to. I certainly talked to people about what was really going on there, which was essentially indiscriminate bombing of Chechen villages. Now you can't cover that from the Russian side because basically you're back with the artillery, which is bombing the villages, or journalists don't get to go into Russian planes, which I certainly had 2 cars shot out from under me, so they were bombing, but you don't see that if you're on the Russian side. The same thing with East Timor and Sri Lanka. I felt they were, but they're kind of not trendy conflicts in a way. I mean, trendy maybe is the wrong word, but Iran-Iraq affects the war. Affects the Gulf, the Iraq War, the last 2 Gulf wars, American, British soldiers involved, Western world interested. There's just a lot of injustice and people being killed with no, maybe documentation is the wrong word, but almost, say this is going on and have some kind of faith. If you can document it or bear witness to it, that somehow you can make a difference. And even sort of 15 years after starting this job, I still think that that's what matters as a journalist in terms of what I want to do as a journalist.
When you say make a difference, define that for me.
It's a good question. I think, I'm not, Rambo, going to go out there and shoot the bad guys. It's not something I want to do, and it's not something I would do well. What I do think is in journalism, you can go to a place and say what is happening and that it is wrong. And I believe that there is right and wrong in the world. I don't believe, you can say a lot about, for example, the American people or Europe. I don't actually think people are that different. I think as a journalist, and what I try to write is, hey, wait a minute, for example, in Chechnya, try to make someone feel that, well, wait a minute here, this could be my brother, this could be my sister. It's actually not that complicated. Wrong things are being done. When I was in Chechnya, I went in with the rebels from Georgia and the Chechen rebels, I got in from Georgia and then met them in Chechnya and went to various villages that had been bombed. And I think that is the way. Well, I've never stopped feeling a sense of outrage. The Russians were reporting we have, for example, today, attacked and eliminated a Chechen force in this village. Now, when you get to that village, very straightforward. What are the bodies? And they're old women, they're poor people, they're children. They're exactly the people who are not the rebels. They're the people who can't get out because they're too poor or too infirm. You can only report that if you go there.
Does a correspondent covering a war have an obligation to anything other than what they say they see to be or believe to be the truth?
I think a correspondent covering the war has an obligation to be scrupulously accurate and scrupulously honest. I don't think that always means we get it absolutely right, because when you are in a situation, for example, Chechnya, or when I was in Chechnya is probably a better example because it's a long-running war. You're out of contact. I mean, there's real physical things. You need electricity to run a satellite phone. I hooked mine up to a car battery a couple times, but you don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. So you're not, sitting in London, for example, with a overall view of a briefing, from Downing Street or in Washington, and all the wires giving you every single side. I think you can report something that that I very much care about. This is what's happening here at this time and in this moment. And I think that's the phrase "rough draft of history." You have an obligation to be correct about it, but you may not necessarily have the overarching picture, but your bit of the picture should be right.
William Howard Russell filed his reports by writing them out in longhand, folding them up, putting them in an envelope, and mailing them back to the Times. How'd you file your reports?
Oh, those were the great days. I mean, it drives me mad. The sort of increase in the quality of communications means your foreign editor can mostly get you. Except somewhere like Chechnya. This may be why I prefer reporting from places like that. He'll kill me hearing this. But certainly in Chechnya, I walked in with a satellite phone. I mean, you walked in with a computer and a satellite phone. But I was living in a hut built into the mountains with about 20 Chechen men. We had one very long bed. The only concession they made to me being female is I got to sleep in the bit by the wall. So you'd have these guys coming in from the mountains, and they would be so exhausted. They'd just fall onto the bed. No way to wash or anything like that. It was freezing. So for a while, certainly for the first story I followed by satellite phone. And then
verbally, just orally filed it, or just hook up your computer to the Iridium?
I filed hooking my computer up to the phone, right. But then after the second week, I was going out, and it was just disastrous. We went to 2 villages that had been destroyed, and then we're coming back, and luckily heard the Russian plane. Scrambled out of the car. The plane then hit the car that I was in, which meant it was destroyed. And I'd actually grabbed my satellite phone, but the computer was destroyed, so there went that. And then we were in this field for about 12 hours, freezing cold. And the plane kept, just when you thought it was safe, the plane would come back and was clearly strafing the field. There was no way out because it was mountains, bare mountains, so you couldn't walk up them. Strafing the field on a grid pattern. So that went on for about 10 hours till it got dark. And I knew I just had a bit of power left in my satellite phone. Couldn't get to the car because it was destroyed. So I started writing longhand on bits of paper, and it was so cold. Then it was just yet another test. The ink kept freezing. So we lit a fire, and I would sort of write longhand, and then heat my pen up, go back to writing longhand again. By now, I'm so freezing. I start editing, very, very severely. I don't really need that, but did manage to, had one of the rebels holding a flashlight, and I read over the satellite phone back to London. And it is amazing, the technology. It was then printed, so.
When you look back at those moments, I mean, there's whether it's Chechnya, Sri Lanka, East Timor, the Iran-Iraq War, or even the most recent conflict in Southwest Asia. There are moments I've described war as 95% boredom and 5% stark terror. Whether you're a soldier or a correspondent, it's almost irrelevant because bullets don't discriminate. Were you ever terrified?
Often.
I mean, I know when you were wounded, but besides that one?
I think there's a level of fear. In Kosovo, for example, I remember walked in because I wanted to cover the on-the-ground side of the war. I remember NATO was bombing. The Serbs were still in possession of Kosovo. The only information we were getting in the beginning was from refugees pouring out over the border into Albania. I was originally in Albania. And it's all very contradictory. It's not necessarily, not necessarily that refugees are lying, but war is really scary, as you say. And, you've been blown up, you've lost a kid, you don't really know what's going on. So there were very contradictory reports from the refugees. I went up to the border and went in with some of the Kosovo Liberation Army people. And I remember just that, a sort of week of in this barracks just across the border. Absolutely bored to death. BBC Radio, read the 2 books I had, talked endlessly over cups of coffee, and then walking out about a week later with the KLA rebels just into the dark. And there's mines all over the place. They have AK-47s, the Serbs have artillery, planes, etc., etc. And that's a very long way of getting to what is fear. I remember every single step thinking, well, we could be shot, because you almost brace yourself for could be shot, and you just keep walking. But with that little thing behind you saying, okay, we could be shot at any moment, but I'm going to keep walking. Part of it is the other people around you are walking. Part of it is you're never going to get to where you're going if you acknowledge fear. I think fear comes later when it's all over.